is a psychological fact that can be observed everywhere in the everyday life of human beings. Whether you are having a conversation and someone tells you that you are projecting, or the first impressions you have of a particular person that turned out to be wrong. In our ideas of other people and situations, we are often liable to make. Projection is a psychological fact that can be observed everywhere in the everyday life of human beings. Whether you are having a conversation and someone tells you that you are projecting, or the first impressions you have of a particular person that turned out to be wrong. In our ideas of other people and situations, we are often liable to make misjudgments that we later have to correct, having acquired better insight. In such cases, most people acknowledge their mistake and let the matter drop, without bothering to ask themselves where the false judgment or the incorrect idea came from. However, to really know who we are, we must concern ourselves with correcting such misjudgments. Many people will cling to them with every fiber of their being, because if one accepts correction, one may fall into a depression. Psychological projection was conceptualized by Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, as an unconscious mechanism where one ascribes one's own motivations, thoughts, feelings, and desires that are unacceptable to oneself, while attributing them to others. It is a misalignment of the inner and outer world, because what one is inwardly, one will see outwardly. When we experience betrayal, abuse, discomfort, etc., we might very well be distrustful of others. This is a defense mechanism, a projection from one's psychological history. When we find certain unacceptable feelings, thoughts, or behaviors in ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge and see someone with that specific trait, we will feel resentment, hatred, and anger towards them. Projection occurs not because of what other people say to you, but rather because of what you yourself think about those people. A person with a strong self-concept, the knowledge of who one is, makes one feel good about who they are. Negative projection is more likely to occur in people with a low self-image and low self-esteem. The real self that always tends towards an ideal self turns into a despised self. For example, a man is afraid to voice his opinion in important matters related to his job. Because he does not like conflicts, he's too shy, insecure, and prefers to remain passive and just do his work quietly. His co-worker, however, is assertive and makes his opinion heard in every meeting, though the shy person believes he has much better opinions. This results over time in his co-worker getting a promotion and a raise. Once he returns home, he will feel hatred against himself and project it onto his co-worker, who has the qualities that he wants to possess. By pointing our finger to other people, we help to reduce the discomfort, anxiety, or bad feelings about ourselves, and avoid taking responsibility to implement those good qualities in ourselves, because it is too painful, difficult, or uncomfortable. Comfortable. When you point one finger, there are three fingers pointing back at you. In this way, we deny that the bad qualities are ours and attribute them to others. We judge, attack, or blame them. This can be extended to whole groups of people with specific ideas. One who lives through projection is convinced that it is others who have all the bad qualities and who practice all the vices. Therefore, it is they who are wrong and they who must be fought against. When one thinks everything is someone else's fault, one will suffer a lot. Projection occurs on an unconscious level. It is unperceived and unintentional. Projections are like an icicle. They return to us. We do not remain unpunished when we project. However, we must bear in mind that we do not make projections. Rather, they happen to us. It is easier to see someone else projecting than seeing yourself as projecting. They are unconscious in nature, and in the moment that you are conscious of projecting, you are already out of its influence. To make the unconscious contents conscious, which includes the withdrawal of projections, represents an important psychological task. that allows for an increase in consciousness and an advance in self-realization. It is not unusual to justify one's projection by inventing a rationale. For instance, the person caught buying on the black market says in self-justification, "Everybody else is doing it." Here the attempt is to convert neurotic anxiety about doing something wrong into objective anxiety about not getting enough to eat. Jungian analyst Marie-Louise France writes, "If a son, for example, experiences his father as tyrannical, in later life he will, in many cases, not only project the quality of tyranny onto authority figures and father figures, such as his doctor, his superiors, and the state, but he will also behave just as tyrannically himself, though unconsciously." If an anti-authoritarian person has to deal with someone who shows even relatively slight manifestations of self-assertiveness or power, the image of the tyrant lying dormant in him will immediately attach itself to the other person. The projection has taken place. The projector is utterly convinced that he has to deal with a tyrant. A mistake of judgment of this kind can only be corrected with the greatest difficulty. It is not only a person's negative conscious qualities that are projected outward in this way, but in equal measure his positive ones. The projection of the latter then brings about an excessive, delusory, inappropriate evaluation and admiration of the object. It is possible for a person to infect others with his paranoid idea and for a sizable group to take up the erroneous judgment until another group finally sets the matter straight. Witch hunts as examples of negative projections, or the veneration of a dictator as a savior hero as an example of positive projections, are witnesses to the existence of the phenomenon of collective contagion. Whole groups can project collectively so that their mistaken judgment passes officially for the acceptable description of reality. Freud believed that the true and false impressions received by a child in his earliest experiences of his parents and siblings play a role in later projections. For example, a child who has experienced his father or mother in a specifically negative form tends to project the same father or mother image onto older men or women he meets in later life. A mother complex is an active component in everyone's psyche, which includes one's personal mother, contact with other women, and by collective assumptions. A negative mother complex makes it impossible to have an unprejudiced experience of other people. Such a negative reaction lives on, stored up in the depths of the psyche, and is projected onto others at a suitable opportunity. Another important phenomenon that Freud conceptualized is transference, where a person unconsciously projects the feelings for another person to an entirely different person. The difference from projection is that transference requires three people. For example, transferring feelings about one's parents to one's partner, or mistrusting somebody who resembles an ex-spouse in manners, voice, or external appearance. This is a typical phenomenon in therapy, and one the analyst must be aware of, lest he engages in countertransference, which may harm the relationship between analyst and analysant. Many suffer from the fact that they do not take into consideration the manifestation of the unconscious in human beings. Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, writes that a man who is unconscious of himself acts in a blind, instinctive way and is in addition fooled by all the illusions that arise when he sees everything that he's not conscious of in himself coming to meet him from outside as projections upon his neighbor. The same unconscious from which projections emanate also strives in certain phases of inner development to correct them through dreams or active imagination. Thus, in addition to the common sense judgment of the collectivity, there's an inner factor in the individual himself that tends to correct his image of reality from time to time. What Freud calls the dream facade is the dream's obscurity, and this is really only a projection of our own lack of understanding. We say that the dream has a false front only because we fail to see into it. Unless we are possessed with an unusual degree of self-awareness, we shall never see through our projections, but must always succumb to them, because the mind, in its natural state, presupposes the existence of such projections.
Little Bob.
here, this summer shop the latest small space solutions at Bob's Discount Furniture. From retro chic bedroom sets to stylish space. Its natural state presupposes the existence of such projections. Jung further elaborated the idea of projection in terms of the concept of the shadow and the anima and animus. The shadow plays a crucial role in projection, both personally and collectively. I have talked about this concept more in depth in another video. As we repress the things we despise in ourselves and refuse to acknowledge them, they remain buried in the psyche and form the shadow, which is essentially what one has no wish to be. We then project like puppets pulled by the strings of the unconscious. Jung writes, the effect of projection is to isolate the subject from his environment, since instead of a real relation to it, there's now only an illusory one. Projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. In the last analysis, therefore, they lead to an autoerotic or autistic condition in which one dreams a world whose reality remains forever unattainable. The more projections are thrust in between the subject and the environment, the harder it is for the ego to see through its illusions. A 45-year-old patient who had suffered from a compulsion neurosis since he was 20 and had become completely cut off from the world once said to me, "But I can never admit to myself that I've wasted the best 25 years of my life." It is often tragic to see how blatantly a man bungles his own life and the lives of others, yet remains totally incapable of seeing how much the whole tragedy originates in himself, and how he continually feeds it and keeps it going. Consciously, of course, for consciously, he's engaged in bewailing and cursing a faithless world that recedes further and further into the distance. Rather, it is an unconscious factor which spins the illusions that veil his world, and what is being spun is a cocoon, which in the end will completely envelop him. With considerable effort, however, we can integrate the contents of the shadow in our personality and become partly conscious of it. This is a lifelong process and is indispensable for individuation, becoming who you are. The reason it is so difficult to acquire insight into one's own shadow is that inferior personality traits are mostly of an emotional nature. Emotions and affects are to a large extent relatively autonomous. They possess consciousness and can only with great difficulty be controlled. If it is not only one's own shadow that stands behind the projections, but also the contrasexual components of the personality, or perhaps still deeper archetypal contents, then insight into the projection in which these are involved is accompanied by almost insuperable difficulties. Jung compares the personal shadow with the collective shadow. With a little self-criticism, one can see through the shadow, so far as its nature is personal. But when it appears as an archetype, one encounters the same difficulties as with anima and animus. In other words, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature, but it is a rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. While the shadow is always of the same sex as the subject, when we talk about the opposite sex, the source of projections take the form of a contrasexual figure. The anima, the female psychological tendencies in man, and the animus, the male psychological tendencies in woman. I have done a video explaining these concepts as well. Jung calls shadow integration the apprentice piece, while anima or animus integration is the masterpiece. This is in the context of individuation. Without a recognition of the shadow, it is impossible to integrate the anima or animus.
When I say when is between the heat and the sweat, water might not be in.
Without a recognition of the shadow, it is impossible to integrate the anima or animus. While the shadow represents first and foremost the personal unconscious, the anima and animus represent the collective unconscious. They symbolize the eternal images of man and woman, of logos and eros, which are projected onto real men and women. A man can project his anima by overvaluing his masculine aspect in detriment to his feminine qualities, by partaking in pseudo-intellectual dialogues, and by treating women simply as an object to fulfill his erotic fantasies, or to make stereotypical assumptions about patterns of behavior such as the way women are. There can also be an over-attachment to one's anima, which is just as harmful, such as a man that is too effeminate and is preyed upon by women, or a man who lives regressively and seeks to return to his childhood under the protecting circle of the mother. Perhaps the most common form of anima projection is being suddenly seized in a maddening and passionate love, like Eros, the Greek god of love, shooting a love-igniting arrow. If those sensual pleasures fail the person who desires and wishes for them, he will suffer, pierced by the arrow of pain. The projection of the animus of woman takes on a slightly different form. It takes on a hidden conviction about one's beliefs, thoughts, and assumptions, such as wanting love, but at the same time not believing anyone loves her. The father endows his daughter with unarguable, true opinions of the right thing to do, not including the daughter's own opinion. This may lead a woman to flee into a dreamy fantasy land filled with all the desires and judgments of how things ought to be. Moreover, the animus personifies all the cold and destructive reflections that invade a woman, which get her into a state where she even wishes death to others. A mother who neglects her spiritual side may compensate by expecting an achievement from her son, such as having him pursue an ambitious academic career in order to satisfy her unconscious expectation. Many people are brought back to themselves through the loving appreciation of another person, the teacher or the therapist who gives credit to his pupil or patient through the expectation of positive results, can often nurture a blossoming of the other's real personality and gifts. One day, though, this projection naturally falls away, and then it must be proven whether one can withdraw his projection and remain himself even without such help. This transition can be managed with the necessary wisdom and awareness of one's psychic reality. Whenever projection takes place, there's first of all a sender and a receiver. One of the oldest ways of symbolizing projection is by means of projectiles, especially the magic arrow or shot that harms other people. It is generally believed that such a projectile is shot by a god, spirit, demon, or some other mythological being, or by an evil person, and that it hits us, causing us to fall ill. The symbol of the arrow is a visual expression of being suddenly hit by a mood or an emotion that often strikes one like lightning out of a blue sky. In late antiquity, the suspicion had already arisen that certain gods might have something to do with the way in which emotions work in human beings, a view that was especially furthered by astrological speculations. Thus, Saturn has something to do with a melancholy turn of mind, Mars with aggression and initiative, Venus and Cupid with love and sexuality, all states of mind or moods that strike people suddenly and overwhelmingly and for a time can overpower the conscious ego. These phenomena are projections from the background of the psyche, autonomous inner images obeying no conscious intention, but coming and going at their own volition. Jung described these as archetypes, collectively inherited forms that produce similar thoughts, mythological images, feelings, and emotions in human beings. These represent the spiritual contents of the unconscious, while the animal instinct, those impulses to action that are characteristic of the human species, represent the instinctual aspect of the unconscious. Ultimately, however, it appears that projections always originate in the archetypes and in unconscious complexes. An attack of aggressive hatred, for example, is felt by us as coming not from Mars, but rather from an evil adversary who deserves to be hated. Shadow projection. Erotic passion not from Cupid, but from a woman who arouses this passion in a man. Anima projection. The harmful words of human beings are like arrows. Deceitful people bend their tongue like a bow and shoot a deadly arrow. Such activities, as we learn from practical psychological experience, are triggered by negative projections. soon as a person projects a bit of a shadow onto another human being, he is incited to this kind of rancorous speech. The words that hit the other person like projectiles symbolize the negativity directed against the other person by the one who is projecting. When one becomes the target of another person's negative projection, one often experiences that hatred almost physically as a projectile.
Now that I have an after-school job, I think I want to buy a drum kit.
That hatred almost physically as a projectile. Jung distinguishes between two kinds of projection, active and passive. Active projection occurs when we thoughtlessly take for granted that the other person is like us, and that what is valid for us is also valid for him, so that we feel justified in improving him, that is, in violating him psychologically. Jung writes, just as we tend to assume that the world is as we see it, we naively suppose that people are as we imagine them to be. We still go on naively projecting our own psychology into our fellow human beings. In this way, everyone creates in himself a series of more or less imaginary relationships based essentially on projection. Passive projection includes an act of empathetic feeling, which serves to bring the object into an intimate relationship with the subject. In order to establish this relationship, the subject detaches a content, a feeling, for instance, lodges it in the object, thereby animating it, and in this way draws the object into the sphere of the subject. All compassion is grounded in this kind of unconscious identity with the others. Passive projection, that is, unconscious empathy, is part of the psychological principle of eros and forms the basis of all social relations. Active projection, on the other hand, belongs to the realm of logos, since it is concerned with an act of recognition or judgment, by means of which we make a distinction between ourselves and the itself unknown object. Both principles can in practice flow into and out of each other. Passive projection is similar to what is known as introjection, the assimilation of object to subject. The difference is that introjection is not necessarily empathetic. It may also arise from a need of respect, power, or superiority. Introjection can be defined as unconsciously adopting the thoughts and behaviors of other people instead of projecting them onto others. This is a natural process of a child's development and relationship with his parents. One naturally introjects the qualities of those whom one looks up to, admires, or worships. This may, however, include the bad aspects of a person or lead to a superiority complex to the point of introjecting the qualities of God onto oneself. The French ethnologist Developmental used the term participation mystique, or mystical participation. The archaic identity of subject and object lives at the very bottom of our psyche. We are instinctively tied to symbols that precedes all intellectualism. Our ancestors were much more governed by their unconscious instincts and participation in nature and the objects surrounding them. The inner world was merged with the external world. It's only a recent phenomenon that our world seems to be cleansed of all superstitious and irrational elements. However, this is not so for the inner world, which does not discriminate between subject and object. Jung writes, only certain functions and areas have outgrown their primary mystic identity with the object. Primitive man has a minimum of self-awareness combined with a maximum of attachment to the object, hence the object can exercise a direct magical compulsion upon him. Self-awareness gradually developed out of this initial state of identity and went hand in hand with the differentiation of subject and object. But as everyone knows, our self-awareness is still a long way behind our actual knowledge. Mystical participation is closely related to projection because the projected mythological images are present in objects, people, and situations. Thought forms, universally understandable gestures, and many attitudes follow a pattern that was established long before man developed a reflective consciousness. It is conceivable that the early origins of man's capacity to reflect come from the painful consequences of violent emotional contents, however, cannot be integrated into the subject into their entirety. The process is like that of peeling an onion. One or more layers of an unconscious complex can, indeed, be integrated by the conscious personality, but not the core itself. In the core we find the archetypes of the collective unconscious, which create projections against our will. Because such content cannot be integrated by ego consciousness. If one wants to understand these projections and prevent their renewal, the content must be recognized as psychically real, though not as a part of the subject, but rather as an autonomous power. If we could see through all our projections down to the last traces, our personality would be extended to cosmic dimensions. Jung wants to compare the ego to a man who sails out in his boat, the philosophical or religious ideas behind his conscious view of the world, onto the sea of the unconscious to go fishing. He must take care not to haul more fish, that is, more unconscious contents, from the sea into his boat than the boat can carry, or it will sink. This explains why people with weak egos often defend themselves so desperately against any and every insight into their negative projections. They cannot bear the weight, the moral pressure that results from such insight. I learned so much from watching, and one of the things I observe most carefully is the exchange of inner alchemical gold. Inner gold is the highest value in the human psyche. It is our soul, the self, the innermost part of our being. In his book, Inner Gold, Understanding Psychological Projection, Jungian analyst Robert A. Johnson presents psychological projection as giving up our inner gold to those whom we idealize or are attracted to. He writes, when we awaken to a new possibility in our lives, we often see it first in another person. A part of us that has been hidden is about to emerge, but it doesn't go in a straight line from our unconscious to becoming conscious. It travels by way of an intermediary, a host. We project our gold onto someone, and suddenly we're consumed with that person. The first inkling of this is when the other person appears to be so luminous that he or she glows in the dark. That's the sure sign that something is changing in us, and we are projecting our gold onto the other person. By observing the things we attribute to the other person, we see our own depth and meaning. Our gold goes first from us to them, and eventually will come back to us. Projecting our inner gold offers us the best chance for an advance in consciousness, and we must learn the arduous task of taking back this gold as we move through life's journey. The work of the alchemists was to transmute base metals into gold. There were charlatans only concerned with material possession. However, for the true alchemists, gold is the metaphor for the spiritual and psychological task of inner transformation. When we see that we have given our spiritual gold to someone to hold for us, there are several ways we might respond. We could go to him or her and say, the meaning of my life has suddenly appeared in the glow in your eyes. May I tell you about it? This is another way of saying, I have given you my inner gold. Will you carry it for me for a while? We cling to people who are the repositories of our gold and won't let them loose. If this person were to leave you and you can't function properly alone, it probably means that he or she has taken your gold. The exchange of gold is a mysterious process. It is our gold, but it's too heavy for us, so we need someone else to carry it for a time. That person becomes synonymous with meaning. A smile can raise us to heavenly heights. A frown will hurl us to hellish depths. So great is the power of meaning. One reason we hesitate to carry our own gold is that it is dangerously close to God. Our gold has godlike characteristics, and it is difficult to bear the weight of it. This is the original meaning of the terms Godfather and Godmother. That person is the carrier of godlike qualities for you. Someone who carries the subtle part of your life, a parent in an interior, godlike way.
From another.
Part of your life, a parent in an interior, godlike way. Robert tells the story of one of his patients who would compliment him every time they saw each other. Robert would tell him, "All these qualities are your values. You need to drape it around my neck for a while, but you're going to take it back eventually." He would tell Robert how valuable he was to him, how lucky he was to have him as a therapist. He was talking about his inner gold and was desperate for someone to take it off his shoulders, for it was too heavy for him. This went on for almost 5 years. Robert writes, "Then one day he said, 'I want my gold back.' I noticed that he was getting restless, so I agreed. 'Things are changing,' I said. 'Let's do a ceremony to put the gold back in your pocket.' I conjured up a small piece of gold the size of a pea, and a few days later we had the ceremony. He held a kernel of gold, shaking, suddenly more aware of what he had been doing. Then he put it in my hands and said, anxiously, 'Suppose you don't give it back.' I said, 'This is your gold, and it belongs only in your pocket. I'm honored that you would allow me to hold it for you all these years, but it's yours, and it needs to go back to you.' The next day, he had his gold all over me again. He couldn't hold it and wanted me to take it back. The exchange of gold is not entirely a voluntary matter. Sometimes it takes a few round trips. We traded the gold back and forth several more times until one day he could withstand it. Since then, I haven't heard any more about him wanting it back. When the exchange of gold proceeds well, we mature and eventually become strong enough to ask for our gold back. Carrying someone's gold is a fine art and a high responsibility. If you are the recipient of someone's gold, hold it carefully and be prepared to give it back within a microsecond's notice. Unfortunately, there are people who collect inner gold and refuse to give it back. It's a kind of murder. It is only after you get your gold back that you can see the gold of the other person. When the time is right, when you're ready to bear the weight, you must get your gold back. If it has an impact, it means there is a war inside me. You set it off, but what you set off is my business. Anything that can burn in a person should burn. Only the things that are fireproof are worth keeping. If you can hurt my feelings, they are better off hurt, because it's an error in me."
Hello everyone, and welcome to the 279th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Obsession. If you like my videos, consider signing up to become a patron over on Patreon, where you can get access to my videos a day early, ad-free, and uncensored for as little as $2 a month. To say that Obsession has become a phenomenon is an understatement, and considering how fantastic of a film it is all around, that only makes sense. And the evil found within this story is beautifully crafted, and more than deserved to be discussed in an episode in this series. And that's what we're going to do here. So without further ado, let's begin. Though there's a critical element in this story that facilitates the evil that unfolds within, all of what happens here, every single thing, begins and ends with one person, and one person only, Baron Bailey, otherwise known as Bear. We don't know too much about Bear's backstory, but at some point in time Bear moved to the town this story takes place in either with his Nana, or to live with her, and that she passed away sometime before the events of this film. But why he moved there is never told to us, and other than this small piece of information, we have nothing to go off of as far as what elements present in Bear's past may have contributed to him developing into the man we see in this film. Based on his overall character, I think it's reasonable to assume that Bear was likely starved for attention throughout his childhood, either when he did live with his parents, because he never really had parents, because his Nana may not have been the most attentive caregiver, or perhaps due to a combination of all three. However, whatever there is to be divined about what contributed to Bear becoming the man he is in this film is purely speculative. What isn't up for interpretation, though, is the fact that Bear is a self-absorbed, needy, insecure, and cowardly young man whose ego-driven desire to win Nikki's affection for the sake of his own satisfaction and inability to obtain that love through regular means is what made all the horrendous events that played out over the course of this film a possibility. The signs that Bear was the man capable of making all this happen were there from nearly the very beginning of this seems innocent enough. More than innocent, in fact. A nervous young man who's not sure how to approach women, that desperately wants to learn how. In these first few moments, Bear seems sweet, anxious and love-struck, but sweet nonetheless. A man in love who seems to have developed these feelings for Nikki over the course of many years, who can't help the way he feels for a girl who seems to have treated him with love and care, and who's always been the first person there for him in times of need. But it's in the very next scene that we're shown that there's something not quite right with Bear. After returning home from an outing a few days later, Bear finds his cat Sandy dead on the floor, poisoned after somehow getting into his grandmother's leftover pain medications, and dying as a result. Curiously though, when Bear examines the scene and begins cleaning it up, he seems rather calm. He did express some degree of sadness when he first discovered her corpse, but the way he investigates, cleans, and then disposes of Sandy's corpse via a trash bag, which he then just throws away, is odd behavior for a person who just discovered their pet lying dead on the floor. Now to be fair, Bear might not have been too upset here because Sandy might have been his grandmother's cat, and he didn't have much attachment to her. But even if that's not the case, and he did have an attachment to Sandy, when examining what a person does in the moments after they experience a sudden influx of grief, you have to keep in mind that grief is often irrational, so Bear could just be numbly going through the motions here, which seems to be the case considering the next scene shows Bear sobbing. But it's this very scene that shows us that what we saw Bear doing in the previous scene weren't the robotic motions one might expect a grief-stricken man to go through. As between his sobs here, we hear him say, "Why can't she just," before the camera pans down to the word obsession at the end of his bed, and then immediately cuts to Bear lying on his bed in the dark and scrolling through Nikki's Instagram profile. Why this is so important is because these few words uttered in the wake of what should have been a heart-wrenching event shows us that Bear is experiencing grief here, but not for Sandy, but for the love he feels he'll never receive from Nikki. Why can't she just what? Sandy can't do anything. She's dead. So if he were talking about Sandy here, you'd think he'd say something more like, why didn't she? Why did she? How could she? When trying to process and come to terms with the fact that his cat had just passed. But no, it's, why can't she just? And though we never hear what Bear wants from this mysterious she, we can only assume that sentence in its entirety was, why can't she just love me? Which is only supported by the aforementioned accompanying scene where he's scrolling through Nikki's profile. Now, it's more than likely that Bear's sobs here were partially brought on by Sandy's death, but it's rather telling of Bear's character that in this moment, where he should have been entirely focused on the death of his cat, that his mind was more so centered on his desire for Nikki, and the fact that she doesn't love him in the way he wants her to. What further supports the idea that Bear wasn't fazed by his cat's death is how nonchalantly he brings up Sandy's passing when he's out at trivia night. And if it weren't for the fact that he in all likelihood doesn't care about this cat very much, maybe this would have been another instance of grief causing people to do strange things and act strangely, as he does admit to Nikki while he's driving home that the death of Sandy isn't okay, but that it hasn't hit him yet. But because I think we can reliably assume that the reason it hasn't hit him yet is because such an event doesn't affect Bear in the way it might affect others because of what he is, the moment where he brings up Sandy's death is what reveals to us what he is, a narcissist. Now initially, that might sound strange, as Bear's narcissism, or the fact that he's a narcissist at all, is not what you typically might expect, and that's fantastic, as like anything, narcissism, or narcissistic personality disorder, is on a spectrum, and not every narcissist is the stereotypical egomaniac who spends most of their free time kissing their own reflection. No. Bear is not a malignant narcissist whose behavior is overtly egotistical. He's a subtle narcissist, a poor me narcissist, one who believes that the world is a cruel place that has made life unfair for a man who deserves to be loved and wanted. And this only becomes more apparent as this story progresses. But why is this casual mention of Sandy's death our first indicator that Bear is a narcissist? Because this is a tactic that narcissists like Bear use to get the attention they feel they deserve or need. What happens as soon as Bear brings up Sandy's death? Well, Nikki and Ian don't hear him, so they walk off. But Sarah does. And what does she do? She hugs him and offers him her condolences. But that's something natural for someone to do in this situation. So again, why is this a sign that Bear is a narcissist? Because of the way Bear brought up Sandy's death. And why? Just prior to him bringing up Sandy, Bear was interrupted by Ian and then Sarah while he was talking to Nikki and trying to score points with her. And so in a moment where the attention he felt he deserved and this opportunity to further his goals was taken from him, he chose to reveal something that would instill pity within those around him so they would then redirect their attention back to him, with the hope that Nikki especially would do so and lavish him with the tender affection and attention that he craves from her, which is made even more evident by the fact that when Sarah hugs him, he first smiles and then looks increasingly distraught as his eyes slowly move towards the path Nikki and Ian took as they walked away, showing us that he's likely staring at Nikki, wishing that Sarah were her. staring at Nikki, wishing that Sarah were her. Now, where does a person learn to behave like this? Well, it's actually natural, as it's something that we all know to do inherently from birth. What does a baby do when they need something? Well, they sure don't ask politely. They cry and scream, which are the only things they can do to express to anyone around them that they're in distress and that they need attention. Now, as we grow older, this behavior typically lessens as we develop better forms of communication to use to express our needs, and realize that affection and attention from others is earned, and is not something that should be coerced out of others. But even in toddlers or young children, you'll find that they'll cry for seemingly no reason at times, or even fake injuries to get your attention and your affection. But again, at some point though, this behavior does typically stop. But if you weren't given much attention when you were a kid, then it's more likely than not that you continue to behave like this throughout childhood, and possibly even into your teenage years and beyond. And this is the case for Bear. Bear, who was likely starved of attention for the majority of his young life, as I mentioned earlier, is on the inside still a baby who knows that the quickest way to get their caregiver's attention is to cry as loud as he can, and the kid who would scream Bloody Mary over a scrape, so long as someone would notice him and give him some attention for a while. Now, you can't really fault a kid who feels forced to resort to this kind of behavior to get attention for doing so, as we all, especially when we're children, require the attention of our parents or other caregivers in order to develop into well-adjusted adults. So of course Bear, who likely was that attention-starved kid, would develop into an adult who felt that coercing people into paying attention to him and lavishing him with affection was an okay thing to do. And that's the difference between the average person who understands that using their cat's stats specifically for the sake of getting people's attention and gaining their affection is wrong, and a narcissist like Bear who, whether instinctually or purposefully, only cares about what such a situation can do for him and his desire to be loved, in this case, by Nikki specifically. Now, in accordance with the title of this film, Bear is an obsessive, a person who, once they feel that something or someone belongs to them, will stop at nothing to make sure that they do indeed belong to them. That isn't to say that crushes like the one Bear has on Nikki are inherently bad things. Far from it, as plenty of beautiful love story have begun with the affections of one person for another slowly becoming known over time, and a relationship blossoming as a result. But here is the crucial difference between someone like Bear who wants the person they're infatuated with to love them no matter what, and a person who's looking to find love. If you're looking to find love, you're doing just that. You're moving through the world anticipating that at some point, the right person is going to come along who you're going to make a connection with, that you're then eventually going to fall in love with, and they you. And when these feelings begin as a crush, a well-adjusted person will pursue the object of their desire, and then either win their affections and proceed to live happily with them, or they'll fail to do so for any number of reasons, and move on. But for someone who's obsessed with another, there is no moving on, only the mad drive to win their affections no matter what it takes. And if there is, moving on for them typically manifests itself in dark thoughts and spite-filled condemnations of the person they were obsessed with, the bitch or asshole who couldn't see the prize sitting right in front of them who, for the rest of their days, is going to have a special place in their mind as a monster who should have known better. For the love that people like Bear wish to extract from others is always for themselves, and themselves alone. They don't love the person they're obsessed with. They love the idea of them and what they think they'll bring to their lives, the romanticized version of them that they believe will result in the manifestation of true love, when in reality, romance, while being important in any loving relationship, is not the same thing as love. And for the obsessed, the care they show their obsession is only ever shown as a means to that end. And we see this with Bear and Nikki when he's driving her home, and they have a conversation about Nikki putting in her 2 weeks at their job. Bear starts off by saying it's going to be weird not seeing you every day. And when she says she isn't happy there, he replies, "It's just a job, Nikki." Notice how he completely ignored the fact that she wasn't happy here, and instead tried to offhandedly convince her that she shouldn't be, because it's just a job. Bear isn't hearing Nikki at all here. All he's hearing is that soon enough, he's going to have reduced access to the woman he's obsessed with, and so his mind immediately jumps to any response that could cause her to reconsider quitting. There is no, "I'm sorry you're unhappy," "Oh, I didn't know you were unhappy," or well wishes, only an attempt to get her to go in the direction that he wants her to go. After this, she responds by saying, "Yeah, well, I want to write," and he says, "I mean you are," which is only more of the same. But then Nikki pours her heart out to Bear by saying, "No, I feel like I need a big life change. I'm not feeling love, and I want to feel love if I want to bring the story to life." Bear's response, with a smirk on his face, he says, "Love? So it's a romance?" Nikki responds by saying, "No, it's not a romance. It's a love story." To which Bear says, "Aren't they the same thing?" But this entire conversation for Bear is all about manipulation, guiding Nikki towards reconsidering her decision and belittling her dreams so she might stay with him and forget about any silly aspirations that might pull them apart. He doesn't see a woman he cares for who's unhappy and only wants to fulfill her dreams. Only the woman he believes should be his, slipping through his fingers. This is only made worse when Nikki admits that Bear is her only confidant, the friend she relies on seemingly just as much as he relies on her for comfort and security, which adds another layer of depravity to Bear's actions here. This is who Bear is, an attention-starved narcissist obsessed with another woman, who spends his days and nights pining for her and fantasizing about being with her, but never really knowing how to make his fantasies a reality. For as much as Bear is this obsessive, he is also a deeply insecure, awkward, and anxiety-ridden man. And with both fear of being rejected and this incessant fantasy of the perfect woman he's in love with constantly running through his mind, this has caused Bear to become a coward in many ways. Not just because he's afraid of rejection, but because in his mind, the only way to win Nikki's love is through perfection. The perfect words, the perfect moment, the perfect gift. When in reality, interactions between human beings are rarely perfect, and the only perfection as far as love is concerned comes about when things are organic, when you let yourself live in the moment and respond to another person with the genuine warmth and care that anyone you might love deserves. But for a man like Bear, even when that perfect organic moment is staring him right in the face, he's incapable of capitalizing on it, with fear and anxiety clouding his judgment and pushing him into believing that he's just going to make himself look stupid and ruin everything if he doesn't do everything perfectly like the way he imagined. And that's the tragedy of Bear's character, for if he could have stepped out of his own head for just a moment, he'd have realized that everything he desired was likely a lot more achievable than he might have thought, as by all accounts, Nikki seemed to have feelings for Bear. It seems ambiguous, especially when you consider that Nikki supposedly told Sarah that she saw Bear as a little brother. But people tell little white lies to hide their true affection for people all the time, and as Nikki said, when she has a crush on someone, nobody knows. But in that moment when Nikki asked Bear outside her house if he liked her, I have a feeling that if he admitted he did, that would have been that, and their relationship would have blossomed from there. And though that relationship might have ended up being toxic because of who Bear is, none of the horrendous things that occurred in the story would have ever happened. But with Bear behind the wheel, that was always an impossibility. And though he couldn't have known what was coming next, he's still very much to blame for all the horrid things that happened after he made his wish. I wish Nikki Freeman loved me more than anyone in the fucking world. A wish made believing that it would end up being what all wishes typically are. Nothing. A prayer made with the breaking of a novelty toy that anyone would have assumed was as meaningless as could be. But here, in this story, it meant everything. From this moment on, the woman known as Nikki Freeman would be replaced and imprisoned. Imprisoned somewhere beyond the ethereal veil that separates this world from the otherworldly. And in her stead would come a creature that we'll refer to going forward as not Nikki. But who, or what, is not Nikki? Well, at first, I thought maybe she was a demon, and that Nikki had been possessed by some sort of succubus. But Curry Barker confirmed that what we're witnessing here isn't demonic possession. And while we may never know just exactly what's going on here, when we take a closer look at not Nikki's behavior, the probability that she's something very specific becomes much more likely. That being nothing. Nothing at all. That being nothing. Nothing at all. Now what I'm about to say is purely speculation, and I could be completely off base here, right on the money, or somewhere in between. But that's the beauty of interpretation and film analysis, as it's often the case that any given person who watches a movie will come away with a different take than the next. So if you have a different take, please let us all know down below. Now, when Bear makes his wish, Nikki instantly begins acting strange, with her making confusing statements about Bear's cat, and her demeanor shifting between giddy, manic, intense, and sorrowful in the span of just a few minutes, which is entirely out of character for her, even if we've only been exposed to her overall personality for a short amount of time. But as you all know well, this behavior only grows increasingly more strange as the film progresses, and the moments where Nikki manages to pierce through the prison she's seemingly been placed in are what emphasize for us the most that whoever this is, it's not Nikki. So who, or what is it? If it's not a demon, what could this clearly separate entity be? Well, I mentioned a moment ago that she's nothing, and what I meant by that is that not Nikki was essentially a blank slate of some sort that got infused with the real Nikki in order to make Bear's wish possible. If we think of the wish-granting process like computation, as the magic that fuels the one-wish willow was calculating how to grant Bear's wish, it found that the real Nikki was incapable of loving him more than anyone else in the fucking world. So it grabbed her soul and placed a completely blank one into her body that it then downloaded her memories and personality into, while simultaneously giving it the directive that it loved Bear Bailey more than anyone in the entire world. This is why, in the first moments that Not Nikki appears, she seems confused and acts bizarrely, because she's blank spiritual or supernatural matter that has been forcibly made to be a direct copy of this woman in a matter of seconds, and so it's getting used to existing for the first time. And because it never was a human, and is only a thing attempting to be a human, for the rest of its existence, it will simultaneously act in ways you'd expect a human to, and in ways that you wouldn't, with its willow-given purpose causing it to behave in ways that satisfies its overwhelming need to love Bear as much as humanly possible, and its movements being strange and creepy as it tries to behave in ways it feels it needs to, in response to any given situation involving Bear, whether positive or negative. And when you consider that Not Nikki is likely warring with the real Nikki for control over her body throughout this story, it makes sense that it will often move in ways that reflect the confusing storm of emotions, both artificial and drawn upon, that are raging inside of it, especially after things start to fall apart for it. A great example of how this thing is attempting to make do with Nikki's own experiences, while simultaneously attempting to do what it feels is best in order to please Baron, is given to us early into her transformation, when she takes Sandy out of the trash and creates a shrine to her for Bear. When Bear sees this, he's understandably freaked out, but Not Nikki is confused, as it knows that Baron just lost his cat, and by rummaging through Nikki's memories, it knows that's not a good thing. So in an attempt to make him feel better, it does what it's seen other people do in Nikki's memories when they're faced with death. It creates a memorial to Sandy, a thing to help Bear cope with her passing, and to revere her. But it doesn't understand that there's a distinct difference between holding a funeral for someone or an animal, and digging their corpse out of the trash, and making a shrine to them on the kitchen floor. That's why, when Bear stumbles upon this scene, Not Nikki is confused, unable to understand why the supposedly helpful thing is upsetting Bear, and when he says it's fucked up, she says she doesn't know if it's fucked, and when Bear replies that it is, she hesitantly asks if that's good, which is a perfect example of how Not Nikki is only mimicking human behavior in the way it believes is best, and doesn't understand why that behavior is less than adequate at times. Despite this, for a time after they officially enter a relationship, things are rather picturesque for the couple, with a whirlwind romance ensuing that's everything Bear could have ever hoped for. But Not Nikki is Not Nikki, and so once it's forced to face anything new or adverse, it begins to behave in ways that are utterly psychotic as it attempts to figure out what to do, and deal with the negative emotions it has that it isn't supposed to have, because any amount of perceived negativity from Bear or anyone around him is taken as a direct assault on its prime directive, to love him more than anyone else, and to receive that same love from him in turn. And because this is essentially its only function, when that function starts to go off the rails, it malfunctions. This is why there's a slow degradation of Not Nikki's sanity as this story progresses, because Not Nikki is the idealized version of Nikki that Bear had in his mind made manifest. And when the fantasy starts to come into contact with reality, Not Nikki begins to break, and to break everything around it in order to make sure that what it was made for is maintained no matter the cost. But with all the horrifying and abusive things we see Not Nikki do in this film in mind, does that mean that Not Nikki is evil? No, I don't think so. Everything in Not Nikki's mind is superseded by its directive to love Bear, so morality is arbitrary for it. It likely knows from Nikki's memories that what it's doing is wrong at points, but that doesn't matter, because nothing matters more to it than ensuring its love for Bear, and his love for her, is protected at all costs. Because I think that's true, I don't feel it's right to label Not Nikki evil, as it's more so an automaton attempting to fill its function than anything else. No, what's really evil in this story is Bear, and the wish he made. But that wasn't the case initially. As we discussed earlier, Bear making the wish he did was more so made out of frustration and desperation than anything. And he, like anyone else, couldn't have imagined that this wish would actually come true. The wish itself is evil because it's one that's designed to force another person into doing something or becoming something against their will. But again, he had no real way of knowing that this wish would be fulfilled. But once that wish was fulfilled, and Bear willingly chose to ignore Not Nikki's behavior so he could enjoy her love like he always wanted to, slowly but surely, his actions become more and more nefarious. At first, he does seem apprehensive about this new Nikki, as he even admits to Ian that she was acting strangely the day after he made the wish. But he does withhold the fact that he made that wish from him, instead trying to rationalize it in other ways, which Nikki seemingly does for him when she tells Ian that she was drunk and high the night before. Now, to be fair, he probably didn't want to mention the wish to Ian because of how absurd it would sound, but the fact remains that even after he discovered a memorial to his cat on his kitchen floor, he didn't think to investigate the One Wish Willow further or do anything to reverse what he'd done to this girl. Maybe, in these beginning stages, he didn't believe that his wish actually worked, or he was in denial. But perhaps that's giving him too much credit, as he was more than willing to enjoy the fruits of this sudden affection she had for him, without really thinking twice about what he'd done, what she had done, and what she was becoming. This only becomes more egregious as the film progresses, as even after strange behavior, Bear still does his best to move past and ignore these things due to his selfish need to have this woman all to himself and to enjoy her love, even when he understands that this isn't the real Nikki, and expresses that he wants this falsified version of her to be more like the real Nikki. But the most damning moment for Bear in this entire film, the moment that puts aside any doubt about how horrendously self-centered he is the scene where Nikki manages to break through while not Nikki is sleeping, and she begs him to end her life, telling him in so many ways how much she's suffering as a prisoner in her own body, or somewhere else far more sinister. Bear's only response is to think of himself, to ask her what's so bad about being with him, before he walks away as she continues to plead for freedom. This, along with every little thing in this film about Bear that points to his selfish nature, is what ultimately brands him a villain. An accidental villain at first, but a purposeful one in the end.
How did you do all that?
Is what ultimately brands him a villain. An accidental villain at first, but a purposeful one in the end. One who willingly ignores the suffering of a woman that he's essentially made into his love slave by inviting this manufactured version of her into her body. A slave that mirrors all the worst tendencies of Bear and Bailey, the cries of anguish that are fabricated for the sake of gaining pity, and an idealized love that's as warped and twisted as the fantasized Nikki he created in his mind. There is another source of evil in this film, the One Wish Willow, and the people behind its making and distribution. But its evil is akin to a genie's, who, through granting wishes, are not necessarily in control of what happens when these wishes are granted, or will grant these wishes in the most literal ways possible, without regard for the consequences they may bring, which is only emphasized by the owner of the shop that sells them mentioning that he had his wish granted, but has seemingly only benefited from it, likely because of the nature of his wish. However, unlike genies, whose moral designation often remains ambiguous, it would seem that whoever, or whatever is behind the One Wish Willow, is far more malicious, as when Bear calls the hotline on the box for help, the person or thing on the other end taunts him with the screams of the trapped Nikki, telling him that the only way to end her suffering is to end her, or end himself, something that the shop owner echoes so casually that it's hard to believe they aren't satisfied in some way by this outcome. As much as that's true, Bear is still responsible here for stringing this affair on as long as he did, with every ounce of harm coming to Nikki, Sarah, and Ian coming as a result of his actions, and his willingness to endanger them for the sake of his own desires. And even in the end, even when two of his dearest friends have paid the price for his negligence, when given the opportunity to make up for some of what he's done by ending his own life, he hesitates, attempting to vomit up the pills he's just ingested with the likely hope that he'll be able to salvage this situation in some way. As after all, this is everything he ever wanted, right? Both fortunately and unfortunately for Nikki though. Not Nikki, consumed by its obsession, and fearing Bear growing apart from it, chooses to use the One Wish Willow to gain his eternal love. But it's too late, and the only person left standing now is the real Nikki, utterly confused, lost, and broken beyond repair amongst a sea of carnage that was unleashed by her hands, but not